Okay, in terms of the stuff, as always, just bad news. Deadlines are the same as they've been all along. Exam number 3, exam number 4, quizzes part 4. Deadline end of day at 11 to 9:59 p.m. on April 24th. Exam number 5, deadline to files on April 30th at noon. You can always do stuff early, but just be sure to complete it by the deadline. For the paper draft deadlines today, I have my normal office hours today, and of course I have my night class at 5:35. And if drafts come in, I'll take care of them and get it back to you. If you drop it off at my office and you don't come back to pick it up, I'll put it in the pickup envelope outside of the main door to the hallway to my office. The +5 deadline is April 14th, full credit deadline April 21st, half credit deadline April 24th. In terms of the grade stuff, for the exams, it's the best 4 out of 5, and which means that if you do the 4 exams and you're not interested in taking the final, you look at your overall grade on a blackboard, which you've done 4 exams and all the quizzes you care to do in the paper, and they'll tell you what you get if you didn't do the final. And since the best 4 to 5 count, if you don't take the final, it'd be a 0, but it'd be dropped off in favor of the 4 that you did do. And so the quizzes are the best 10 out of the lot, they're 30%, the exams, best 4 out of 5, 40%, and the paper, best paper out of the paper for 30%. And you get to see your real grade in the class in real time. Fire up your browser, go to Blackboard, look at your overall grade column, and that tells you where you are and what you get if you just stop doing stuff. Before heading to the new stuff, namely talking about our good dead friend David Hume, looking at a little skepticism regarding the senses, anything about the stuff to be or the stuff that has been that needs more stuff.
Did we do custom and conclusion? Did we do that last class period? Where did we leave off?
Yes, we finished up with the, last time we finished up the cause and effect stuff, and Hume's, basically his view about the custom is this, is that, again, even though his ultimate conclusion about causation is that essentially what we do is one thing is followed by another, and crudely put, we get habituated to think that when A occurs, B occurs after suitable, experiences, that really we never see the, causation, the force, or the power. But he believes we need that custom, that we need that habituation, otherwise we wouldn't be able to make any predictions or plan, etc. And then he also, being a historian, he looks at the notion of how, we talk about distant times and places based on history. We need that, well, normally we call it a causal chain, but since Hume thinks that causation is just, getting that can be habituated, is he thinks we have to trace back what we're saying today back through, a line back to the original event. And he thinks that doing history is, many historians would agree with him, is having, tracing it back that way. He thinks that, one thing followed by another, and that would give us the basis for historical claims. But ultimately, kind of his view of causation is that essentially what we do is we experience, one thing followed by another, we remember that, and if it happens enough, we come to be habituated and believe that A occurs, and we believe that B will follow. But his skeptical claim is that we never see the cause and effect, we never see the force and the power. It is essentially psychological habituation. And for him, that's essentially his analysis of causation. And a good analogy, as mentioned last time, was Pavlov's dog. Rang the bell, dog, you give the dog food, it expects the food after you do that enough. But of course, the bell, we never see the causal connection. And so for Hume, you put popcorn in the microwave, pop it out, it pops, and do that enough, and then you expect that when you put the popcorn in there, it will pop. And so causation for him is just that expectation, habituation. Okay, anything else? Now Hume then turns to skepticism regarding the senses. Now, most of the dead guys we looked at, they do address the problem that we know as the problem of the external world. And the way it's put quite simply is this: how do you know what's going on here matches what is out there? Now Hume, when he kind of engages this problem, he essentially says from the start that the question about whether objects, do they really exist or not, he says it's a vain question. It's unanswerable. So in a way, he kind of, right from the start, gives up on that particular problem. He says, if you ask whether bodies exist or not, external objects, it's vain to do that because there is no answer. So what he does instead is he focuses on a psychological question, namely this. So he's not addressing the metaphysical question of, do objects really exist out there? Is there really an external world? He focuses on the psychological, which is, why do we believe there is an external world? To use kind of a crappy analogy, imagine someone who thinks there's a monster in their closet. Well, we assume, of course, there is no monster in their closet, but the interesting thing for the psychologist is, why does a person believe that? And so in the case of objects, for Hume, we have no way of answering the question, are there objects out there? So all he wants to look at is, why do we do this? So essentially, psychology. Now, he breaks this question down to two questions. So the question is not, how do we know there are objects out there, or are there objects out there? The question becomes this. Question one, why do we attribute continued existence to our perceptions? Now, continued existence essentially means that when we're not perceiving them, they continue to exist. Which is similar to, but different from a second question. The second question is, why do we suppose a distinct existence? Now the difference is this. Continued means it keeps existing even when we're not, perceiving it. But of course, that's consistent with, you might say, different from a distinct existence. So distinct is basically existing apart from us, and continued is existing when we're not perceiving them. Now, do we think that, well, to use normal language, do we think that when we look away from, say, the wall, that it's still there?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think this stuff has a continued existence. Like if you have a car, you're not looking at your car right now, but you believe that it continues, or something, your perception will continue to exist. The second thing is a distinct existence, namely that we think that it exists, roughly put, outside of our minds. Now for someone like Berkeley, something could have a continued existence, but not distinct. It could continue to exist, but not exist apart from our mind. Now, according to Hume, if we're able to answer, one question, we can answer the other, or so he claims. If perceptions exist unperceived, then they must, would have a continued existence. And one might infer that if they continue to exist and we're not perceiving them, they have perhaps a distinct existence. Although someone like Berkeley would break those apart separately. Something could continued existence, even without perceiving it, distinct from us, because God would be watching it. Which then ends up in kind of the problem Berkeley ended up with is, well, if God is watching stuff, what is he watching? Wouldn't it just then exist apart from us? Now, he wonders where we get this notion from. And he considers maybe it's from the senses, maybe it's from reason, or maybe it's imagination. Maybe we're just making stuff up. And so again, Hume's basically doing psychology, asking why do we believe that? Imagine what is, he's putting humanity onto the psychologist's couch, asking why do you believe there's a monster in your closet? Except in this case, the question is, why do you believe there are objects out there? Now, the first thing he considers is the senses. Can the senses give us the proof, the notion that our perceptions exist when we're not perceiving them? In other words, to use kind of a crappy illustration, can you see something when you're not seeing it?
No.
No, unless you want to do like some kind of Zen thing. I'm seeing without seeing. But yeah, if I try to prove that the wall, has a continued existence when I'm looking at it, by looking at it, I can't do that. Because if I'm looking at it, I'm looking at it. If I'm not looking at it, I'm not looking at it. So that's not going to work. Secondly, the same with the distinct existence. I can't prove that's my perceptions of a distinct existence through my senses. Same sort of problem. I can't prove that it exists apart from me by seeing it when I'm not seeing it. Because I'm not seeing it, I'm not seeing it. It's kind of, reminiscent of Berkeley's problem. He says, can you conceive of something existing unperceived? And Berkeley says, oh, you're perceiving it all the while. Except in this case, it's a legitimate trap, in the sense that you can't sense what you're not sensing. So I can't, crudely put, I can't see there's something there when I'm not looking, because I'm not looking. And so I can't know from that if it's a continued or distinct existence. So that tosses out the senses. Now, what about the question of, deception? Because, one of the things we, looked at with our good dead friend Descartes, in the papers about, is Descartes, lays forth in the first meditation his skepticism regarding the senses, that we could be deceived, by all these, for example, he gives like optical and perceptual illusions. They can deceive us, so we shouldn't trust our senses. Then he brings up the dream problem, and the evil demon problem, and then we're, totally in trouble. So Hume also wants to address a similar question. Can we trust our senses? Now, he does wonder about, again, why we think there's stuff, out there. Now, one reason we do this is we kind of think like this. When we're perceiving stuff, it's as if stuff is external to our, body. For example, most stuff is, fortunately, because if you get like a stick sticking into you, that's kind of bad. But I think that the bottle, the backpack, and all this stuff is external to my body, because I can look at myself and say, okay, that's not like stuck in my side, because that would be hurting a whole bunch. But he claims we think that way. I mean, the most rational reason to think that stuff is out there is you'd say, well, I'm here, stuff's there, it's out there, like the truth. But Hume says there are the following reasons as to why that doesn't work. Reason one, he claims we don't actually perceive our body. What we have is various sensory perceptions. Now, Hume doesn't explicitly make this argument, but one way to sort of see that maybe he's being pretty reasonable about this is take Descartes' dream example. When you're dreaming, in a sense, you're not perceiving your body. You've got like a dream body, because everyone when they have dreams, you'll be looking at yourself. But clearly, unless you believe it's like a separate dream reality, you're not looking at yourself, you're just dreaming. And all the stuff that's happening in the dream, we believe, is all in our mind. It's not happening, for real. And so in our dreams, it seems like there's external stuff, but obviously it's all in our mind. So we don't actually perceive a body, we just have perceptions. So, throwing in a little extra from Descartes, we could all, it could be dreaming this. And so the bottle and the table and stuff is all in my mind. Second reason is this. We go back to the primary, secondary quality stuff, namely the idea that the primary qualities of objects are things like mass, density, volume, and the secondary qualities are things like color, taste, the sounds. And in the case of things like the secondary qualities, they're taken to be, we think about our perceptions having this continued existence, we think it as being continued. But of course, do they exist like out there? Well, we know from looking at, our good dead friend's log that, the taste, the color, the sound is not out there, it's in our minds. And so that doesn't tell us that there's stuff out there. And again, Hume could have kind of done it easily. You could just, do a Descartes sense and dreams. All this stuff doesn't prove it. Last thing, which also can be tied into the dream thing, is this. One reason you think we're in three-dimensional space is because of distance. The wall is over there. The podium thing is over here, so I have to walk over to get to it. It seems like things are at a distance. But, as Hume notes, our vision doesn't inform us of distance like immediately. We're not seeing distance. We judge distance. And Hume seems to be right about this. Like I mentioned before, there are cases of in recent years where the people who are blind from birth, and then a simple operation gives them sight so they can see. And people were able to, since people's sight was being not restored because they didn't have it, but basically they were given sight, and to see how they handle things like distance. And kind of an interesting question was, would people just immediately see distance and be able to do all that stuff? And they found that it turns out Hume and others were right. When that happens, people don't get distance. They have to learn. They have to learn all this stuff. Now, we don't remember doing that because we were learning it back when we were like a few days old. We're figuring out like tables and chairs and stuff. And so he seems to be right that we don't see distance, we judge distance. And we can also use the example to sort of support Hume that I used before. Think of video games. You're not seeing distance. You are just your mind is processing that stuff, and that the screen is literally essentially just photons, essentially two-dimensional, but you describe it in terms of three-dimensional space. Especially if you have one of those VR things on. None of that stuff is like really three-dimensional, but it looks that way. And so Hume didn't obviously have VR or computer games, but he had things like paintings to access, so you could support Hume further that way. So it seems you're right. Our experiences don't show this stuff out there. And probably the easiest way to argue that is what Descartes did. It could all be just a dream. Or as Berkeley did. It could all just be all the experiences you have could be just in your mind with nothing out there. But still, again, his question is, because he assumes we can't answer the question, is there stuff out there? We can only answer the question, why do we think stuff is out there? Now, he then turns to talking about the philosophers and the vulgar. Now, in this case, he doesn't, by the vulgar, he doesn't mean people who are go around swearing a lot. What he's essentially doing, it's a common distinction that philosophers used to make, and they probably make now, is this would be sort of like the scientific academic view, and this would be the common sense view. And vulgar is kind of a meaner way of putting the popular view. So this would be kind of the learned view, the theoretical view, and common sense. In philosophy, the sciences do run into that kind of challenge. We have like what the science stuff tells us, and then we have what we believe from everyday experience. To give like another example, in psychology they talk about folk psychology, kind of the everyday stuff we use about beliefs, thoughts, etc. And then there's sort of like the scientific psychology. There's also how the world seems to us. It seems like there's color out there, but science tells us color's all in our minds. There's no color out there. And so Hume's, making that same sort of distinction. Now, of course, one obvious problem with this is that even though he lumps all the philosophers together, not every philosopher obviously believes the same thing. So it would have been more accurate to say certain philosophers and also sort of like our common sense views. So not being super careful, but there you go. Now he claims, to make the distinction, we have three types of impressions conveyed by our senses. The first ones are what we call, the primary qualities. Things like figure, bulk, motion, and solidity. And so, if we take like the example of the table, it conveys to me the impression of a certain shape, a certain, solidity, and, weight, and all these qualities that are supposed to be out there in the world, real for real. Secondly, convenient enough, we have the secondary qualities, which would be, the color of the table. It probably has a taste, but I'm not going to taste the table. That's a good way to get God knows what. And it, you can also talk about the sound of it, etc. And it has a certain coolness. It's a little cooler than the room, or at least cooler than my hand. Then the third category are pains and pleasures. How like the soothing coolness of the desk, for example, or the enjoyable taste of a pizza. Now Hume says the distinction between the philosophers and the vulgar. The question is like, okay, to what do people attribute continued and distinct existence, or put in a way that Hume would not approve of, because it talks about stuff being out there. What stuff do we think of as being out there, and what stuff do we think of as not? Well, for the philosophers, they believe the primary qualities, and again, he's being kind of sloppy because he's just taking all philosophers and squishing them together, because Berkeley obviously wouldn't agree with this. But if we take that scientific view, the primary quality is supposed to be out there. And if you ask, common sense, just ask people, and you ask people like, okay, where's the table? People would say, there. Does it, does it exist when you're not looking at it? Yeah. Does it exist apart from you? And you're like, yeah. Why are you asking me such weird questions? Now the secondary qualities, science and philosophers tell us those are all in our mind. Color's not out there. The sound is not out there. Warmth and cold not out there. But the common sense view, at least until people get exposed to science and philosophy, is what? Suppose you were talking to a 3-year-old and you said, little Billy, where is blue? Billy would point to yeah, he wouldn't point to his mind, unless he said some philosophy. Intuitively we think that stuff is out there. We think the sound is coming from over there. The color is there. The warmth is, the room is warm or cool. But of course, the philosophers and scientists tell us it's all in our mind. There's a certain physical structure to the wall, and the photons hit it, and it hits our eyes, blah, 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 blah. And we experience color. Color's in here, but all the physical stuff's out there. But the kind of what you see, what you get, the Wysiwyg view is all those secondary qualities are out there. Now when it comes to pain and pleasure, both the philosophers and the vulgar, so to speak, think those are in our minds, that pain is not out there, and pleasure is not out there. So if you ask, little Billy, where does it, if he trips and falls, where does it hurt? Where's the pain? I mean, obviously you grab like his knee if you skin his knee, but he'd say, well, is the pain out there in the world? And Billy would say, why are you asking me this? Get me to the hospital. Right? If you ask them where's the pain, they would say it's pain is in me. Yeah, it's a good song. It could be a song title. Pain is in me. Make a note of that. Copyright. Right. Or a trademark. Need some lyrics though. Need some lyrics. So that's sort of the conflict. Namely, the philosophers, basically science tells us this is out there for real. This is in your mind. This is in your mind. Our common sense view is this is real for real. This is also real and out there. This is all in your mind. Now, so far, again, Hume's going to look at. He's trying to answer the question: why do we think there's stuff out there? And he says the senses don't give us that, because whatever reason we have to believe there's continued existence and distinct existence, it's not our senses. So he considers next, maybe it's reason. Maybe reason is the basis for this belief. Well, here's the problem. When, think back like when you were a kid. We're dealing with like actual kids now. Do kids believe that, sounds and colors are out there because they've consulted science and philosophy? No. So whatever reason that people have to believe, the secondary qualities are out there, it's probably not from, because that's kind of our common sense view before we've gotten into science and philosophy, before we've thought about it. It's only when we get exposed to some science, or philosophy that we get that view. Because it's normal to think that it's, totally intuitive to think color's out there. In our normal everyday life, we act that way. We now know color's in the head, but for practical purposes, we treat it as if it's out there. Like if we're, getting the house painted, picking your paints for like your kitchen, you don't say, I wish to have a substance that will cause my inner states to experience the color of, Bordeaux, which is of course entirely my mind. Now you say, I want my kitchen this color. So. Now what about with the primary qualities? Well, do people believe there are objects out there because of, science and philosophy, because they've read, Descartes? If you ask like a 3-year-old, where's the dog? The dog is there. They do that because they've read Descartes, they've been convinced from the existence of the external world? No. So those beliefs that we've got don't seem to come from reason. So we end up with two, contrary conclusions, which is this. Sense of philosophers, the sciencey view is, this is real, continued, independent, this is not. The common sense view is, of course, this is continued and distinct, this is also continued and distinct, this is not. So we end up with the contrary views. For philosophy, the view is that all that appears in the mind, and this is basically, again, he's being kind of sloppy because what he's talking about is what we call representative realism. That what is, in your mind, still represents what's out there. And so he says that if we take the philosophical view, that all that's in your mind are those perceptions that are non-continued, non-distinct, and the common sense view is that those things are continued and distinct. You can take a concrete example. If we think the color's out there, we think the color's still there when we're, because you ask somebody, what color is your shirt when you're not looking at it? And their answer would be, well, it's whatever color it is. And of course, science would say, aha, it has no color when you're not looking at it. It's a touche. And so, so we're given, two inconsistent, claims. Now, so, why then, well, if reason's not going to help us, what's left? Well, if senses can't help us, reason can't help us, then it's got to be, well, again, to Hume's satisfaction, he thinks that senses are out, reason is out. So it's got to be imagination. Why? Well, here's why. Suppose we take the vulgar view, that what you see is what you get. The perception is the object. What we just described as naive or direct realism. Now, if we do that, we can't infer the existence of one from the other, which is, crudely put. If we think the shirt is the same as our perception of the shirt, we can't infer the existence of the shirt from the existence of our perception. Why? Well, Hume's reasoning is this. He thinks, which is kind of ironic given his view about the whole cause and effect thing, the only claims we can make about matters of fact are from causal reasoning. And so if we take perceptions and objects to be the same, then to have cause and effect, you've got to have, the two different things, A followed by B, object followed by perception. But if they're the same, you can't have it follow itself. So reason can't help us there. Now, suppose we take perceptions and objects as different. Well, in that case, he thinks we still can't do it. Why not? Well, roughly put, I mean, one way that we can look at supporting him here is just a classic skeptical argument. If they're the same thing, you can't make a causal connection because they're the same. And if they're different things, we have that classic problem of you're never able to observe the object apart from your perception. You know, it's basically skepticism 101. So Hume basically traps, himself or us in a nice dilemma. If they're the same, no cause and effect reasoning there because they're the same. If they're different, you can't get one from the other. I mean, you could use cause and effect, but you got to observe one followed by the other. But you can't do that because you can't observe the object. You can only have your perception. So, do, essentially. Now, another way that people have tried to take out, this is basically our good dead friend Berkeley, is the vividness argument. That we might say, okay, if things are very vivid, we attribute them to this external, distinct, continued existence. But Hume raises a pretty good point. Things like emotions, passions, pains and pleasures, which everyone accepts, it's all in your mind, they can be extremely vivid. Pain is like super real, anger, super real. And so just going by vividness, we wouldn't say I'm really, really angry, so my anger is like has continued distinct existence. So Hume ends up concluding reason can't help us here. So it's got to be imagination. So then, how does the imagination, again, he's sort of psychoanalyzing us. Why is it we believe what we do? Before we're seeing, according to Hume, why we believe what we do, anything about the stuff so far? It needs more stuff.
I don't see how you teach this. It's confusing.
Oh, you just do it. It's like Hume said, just constant, conjunction. You just do it over and over again. I've been teaching this class for 11 years now. And
So you got it down there?
Oh, yeah. And of course, I started my undergraduate careers in philosophy centuries ago, back when I was hanging out with David Hume, because I knew all these guys. We were hanging out. Well, that's kind of a lie. I'm not that old. Pretty old, but not that old. So then, why do we believe this stuff? Well, Hume says, philosophers and science types reject the vulgar hypothesis. We say, well, it's still the science of today. According to science, the theory of perception today, color, taste is not out there, it's all in your mind. What we call the primary qualities are out there, pain, pleasures, also in your mind. But then the question, which is a good question, why do we think there's stuff out there? Now, one thing, of course, is this. Constancy. The things that we think of existing with continuity have a constancy. In other words, what I mean by constancy, take an example as this. I'll use kind of a simple, stupid example. No matter how many times you come into this building or walk through Tucker Hall, the things are always in the same place, roughly. I mean, obviously the desk can be moved and so forth. You come in the room, the windows are there, the door is here, the screen thing is here, and everything is pretty constant, as a constancy. Similarly, like with looking at your own physical self. You don't find, your hand stuck to your head, which is good. Everything seems pretty constant. Things are, have this constancy. And so as Hume sees it, the constancy leads us to think, in general, that the stuff is continued. Because one way to explain the constancy is it has continued existence. It just keeps on going. Now it does note, realistically, that the constancy, of course, is imperfect. You come in the room, and the chairs may be moved all around. You go on vacation, you fall asleep like in the sun, and you wake up and you've been you got blisters and you've been kind of cookified, which is always a bad way to wake up. Or someone pranks you and shaves your head during the night. You look different, but there's still a fair amount of constancy. Also, he points out, in addition to constancy, we also have coherence. And coherence is this, that even when stuff changes, there's still a coherency about them. So, for example, doesn't give an example of this, but when you visit the building, there's a certain constancy. It stays kind of the same, but even if it changes, there's kind of a coherence to it. And so he thinks that perhaps this provides an avenue with constancy and coherence to why we believe what we believe. Now we do, however, make a distinction between the external and internal impressions. For example, the emotions, the passions, are connected to each other, but we don't believe that they exist, continually and, distinctly. So, with those, take for example anger. We don't think that anger is like continued and, and distinct. But external objects, the way we make sense of them is we think that they continue to have continuity and distinctness. Otherwise, it doesn't make a lot of sense. For example, Hume uses his, well, I was going to say famous, but nothing really so really famous in philosophy, except the tree falls in the forest dealing. He's given an example, like he's in a room, and a porter brings him a letter. And in order to make sense of that, he's going to basically make use of the notion of coherence and constancy, which would be this kind of thing. In order for the letter to get to him, he would say, well, since he knows that or believes that people don't float on air and can't fly, there must have been stairs for the porter to get to him. When he gets a letter from a friend, say in America, let's say Ben Franklin, he has to put all the steps in place. There had to be like whatever's between his house and like the port. There had to be like the ocean there, the other city, there'd be Ben Franklin, all that stuff in between. And so to make sense of this, we've got to infer a continued and distinct existence to stuff. Or by kind of informally, to make sense of our world in a way, do we have to think that the stuff is out there and it keeps on going, even when we're not looking at it?
Yes.
Yeah. Intuitively you think your car is waiting for you. That it's still there. That we're standing on this floor and we think, well, there must be like stuff underneath it. And we think that the stuff we saw on the other side of the wall, we think it continues and distinctly exists, even though we're not looking at it, because in order to make sense of the building being here. But the good question again is, of course, why? Why do we think that? Well, this sort of reasoning is not causal reasoning. Why not? Well, with causal reasoning, again, at least as Hume sees it, it's that A occurs, B occurs. This happens a whole bunch of times, and then you just sort of get habituated to say, A causes B. But this can't, given his argument, this can't happen with this, because we don't experience the object, experience our perception, and we're not able to say, that is followed by this is followed by this. We just experience this. So when we're reasoning from coherence, we're not reasoning from cause and effect. We're just reasoning from it's coherent, so therefore, when we're trying to reason from coherence, it's coherent, so it's distinct and or continued. Or so we close. Now, so why do we think that way? Well, basically what he thinks is this. We get a regular sequence of perceptions. And you can try this yourself. For example, you can look around the room and imagine, to use a crappy analogy, imagine like each kind of second is like a video frame. Like, have you ever seen like a film timeline, like a real film or like digital? And of course, when you look at each of the the cells, they look very similar. And so Hume says what we kind of do is, from the regularity of our perception, we tend to think that, okay, as I look around the room, the room is not like going out of existence, and it's not like new rooms are created. I think I'm looking at a continued and distinct room. But of course, as he notes, we can't go from my perceptions have a regularity, that name like when I'm looking, my perceptions are similar to each other, to there's a room that's existing distinctly and continually. And again, the problem is, I can't get out of my mind and have the continued distinct thing comparing to my perception, or so it claims. So I still don't know why we believe in stuff. Well, the next thing he tries is this, namely the imagination. So what do we do? Well, this. I mean, you can take take the following stupid example. If I take the marker, put it behind my back, you can't see it, and take it out again, do you think it's the same marker?
Yeah.
Yeah. Are you sure?
Not entirely, but.
No, 'cause I could have had one. Yeah, I could have one stuck in my belt, and I could do one of those magic trick deals, which is not very tricky or very magical. Now I don't know which one is a good one. Okay, that's how you tell. Yeah, so what we do according to Hume is that obviously we don't perceive continuity or distinctness. We just imagine. And so what we do is, to make the coherence makes more sense if we kind of imagine that when we're not seeing it, that its continuing and distinct existences going on makes sense. But we don't see it through our senses, by definition. Reason, he claims, we can't do that cause and effect reasoning. And so what's going on is basically our imagination. We imagine that which is, to use, the imaginary example, the way, in a way magic tricks kind of work is because our imagination fills in the pieces. It's our imagination in a way that kind of tricks us. And so as Hume sees it, in order to have the coherency, we suppose that, to make sense of our experience, we imagine it keeps on continually and distinctly existing when we're not seeing it, in order to explain the coherence. So basically, in a way, it's kind of an habituation thing. We see it happening, we get kind of habituated, and we get that we basically imagine that it's the same thing. But again, magic tricks show that we can easily be tricked by this. Now, in a way, the problem here is one that's still really a problem in psychology. If you're familiar with psychology of child development, etc., it's the notion of object permanence. And when people play the games with the kids like peekaboo, etc., kids have to learn object permanence. They learn pretty quickly, but it's something we do have to learn. So Hume's investigation, this is actually something that's still looked at today. Why do kids think that objects keep on going? Initially, they don't. It takes a while to learn that concept. Now, coherence by itself, of course, is not enough. What we also need, in addition to coherence, is constancy. We need, there to be both, whoever claims, both of these things, coherence and constancy. So how does these, in a way, the psychology of this work? Well, as he sees it, is this. We get accustomed to constancy. To use a kind of crappy example, every time you look up here, the water bottle, seems to be there. And, speaking with a vulgar, we'd say the water bottle is there. But of course, speaking, as Hume would see it, you have resembling perceptions that have a constancy and a coherence. The bottle seems to be here all the time so far, looks the same, and so what do? Well, we run into this sort of, contrary thing, namely this. When you look away from the bottle, of course, you're not perceiving it. So the perceptions are interrupted. You look away, you're not seeing it, look back, think it's there again. But we tell ourselves the bottle's still there. So we end up with a contradiction. We got gaps in our perceptions, but we think the bottle's still on the table. So what we do is we end up creating, this kind of weird notion, namely that our perceptions are somehow connected by an insensible real existence. Put in vulgar terms, we believe the bottle is still there. Or put it in kind of human terms, we believe that some of our perceptions are going along unperceived. So we end up with, from the constancy, from the coherence, from our imagination, we end up with that notion, or so we claim. Now, before pressing on with the rest of Hume, anything about Hume so far that needs more Hume stuff?
Did you give the example of the room, porter, and letter?
Oh, yeah, that was the example. Hume's basically, he's talking about how in order to, sort of make sense of things, we need to attribute to them sort of, this coherency and constancy. So he says, if he's in his room and a porter brings him a letter, to make sense of that, he's got to essentially believe in the continued existence of things and distinct existence of things beyond his perceptions. Like, okay, the porter came to the room, he's never seen like people, flying, so he thinks that it'd be stairs. The letter has got like postmarks on it, it comes from, say, let's say hypothetically his friend Benjamin Franklin, and so he has to make sense of that, he's got to, in a way, believe that there are, roads and posts and boats and the ocean, and then, in the case of Ben Franklin, America, and, that he wrote it. So he has to make sense of that experience. He's got to believe in the existence, not the existence, but the continued existence and coherency of all this stuff. Yeah, so kind of the point of that is he thinks that, in a way, we sort of have to imagine all that stuff still being there when we're not perceiving it. That's kind of the point of that example. Or so I claim. Anything else? Now, Hume then turns to his claim that the perceptions have neither an independent nor continued existence. Why? Well, he claims their independent existence is contrary to plainest experience. And he gives the following proof. Now, what he does, don't try this at home, just poke your eye out, but if you press like on your eye, you can double your images. Yeah. And we don't think that, even though they're both, we're having two equally sort of, valid perceptions, we don't believe we created two distinct objects. So, here's this, my usual stupid illustration. Suppose, you want to double your money, and you put the money on the table and do this, it doesn't really double your money. You can't walk to the bank, push your eye, and say, oh, Mr. Banker, or Mrs. Banker, please push on your eye so you'll see that I have, $40,000 instead of $20,000. Because we don't think that they have that independent, continued existence. And Hume says, his reasoning is, there's no difference between like the double perception and the single perception. And we don't think one is continued and independent, blah, blah, blah. We shouldn't think the original is. Or so he claims. Now he also runs through the usual things we saw like in Locke and Berkeley, namely, perceptual relativity. That objects, seem to get bigger and smaller as they get farther away or closer. That, if you can take the example, like you take like a coin and you turn it at a different angle. If you've ever like learned how to draw, you can see, what he's getting at. You're doing shapes, from different angles, they look quite different. And of course, it gives an example of illness where colors and taste and stuff change. And he claims that all of this stuff shows that really it's not what you see is what you get in a way, that our perceptions are not independent or continued, because they seem to all be dependent on us, because all those changes affect our perceptions, and they don't seem to be continued. So he claims that going, kind of reasoning through the whole thing about perceptions, they're not independent, they're not continued. So where does this take him to? Well, basically to this. We saw earlier the stuff about the philosophical and vulgar system. The philosophical system, again, is that you've got, again, he's going after what we call representational realism. That you get the idea in your mind, and the object out there is represented by the idea. And so the perceptions are interrupted, perishing, changing, in the mind. The objects are uninterrupted, they continue, they have an identity, and they're not in your mind. Now, Hume makes the following sort of damning claim. He claims that the philosophical thing is what he calls a palliative remedy, which is basically, we're deluding ourselves. We're basically, faking ourselves out. And he claims that, secondly, that it has all the difficulties and problems of the vulgar system, plus more of its own. So kind of his first claim is, this is not really a solution, we're just basically deluding ourselves. Secondly, in addition to the problems that it gets from the vulgar system, it's got problems of its own, so it's like double problems. And of course he also claims it has no recommendation to reason, because his view is basically, if you really think about it, there's no foundation to reason, or the imagination. It gets all its influence on the imagination from the vulgar version. So again, doing his analysis, he thinks that essentially our philosophical view is delusional and full of problems, and whatever influence it does have, it comes from the vulgar system. So he goes through and tries to prove each of the parts. First part. He claims basically the philosophical thing is merely a palliative remedy and has no recommendation. And here's how he reasons. Now his argument rests, of course, on his particular interpretation of cause and effect. But in a way, it's just he's essentially sort of recycling the classic skeptical argument. And in his view is to do cause and effect reasoning, you've got to have A followed by B, and then it happens over and over again. And even habitually, A is followed by B. You proceed putting the microwave in the microwave, or popcorn in the microwave, and put in the time, popcorn. Do it again and again and again, and then you get habituated, so you put the popcorn in, that you're going to get it popped. Now Hume says, as the skeptics did before him, you can never, using his own particular language, in order to get the A followed by B, you can never get object followed by perception. Again, the classic skeptical ones, you can't get out of your own mind, you can't look at your mind and what supposedly is out there. You can't do that. And so Hume basically, stealing that classic skeptical argument, says that notion just can't work. Since it has no foundation in reason, we're basically just making something up to make ourselves feel better. Or so he claims. So science is all there just to make us feel good about stuff. Now what about the second part? Well, his claim is, the second part is, it's got all the problems of the vulgar system, and the other part of the problem is, whatever influence it's got doesn't come from itself, because it's got no foundation, it's all from the vulgar. Now, his reasoning is, well, in a way his argument is essentially he's kind of saying the same thing. Namely, he basically says that, okay, to his satisfaction, he's shown that the philosophical system, nothing going for it, no proof for it. Nothing from reason, nothing from imagination. And so, whatever appeal it's got to be stealing from the vulgar system, or so he claims, the common sense view. And that's pretty much it. He just makes that as his argument. It's got nothing of its own, so whatever it's got to get from the other thing. Now, so what we do, he claims, is this. our imagination leads us along this delusional path. First, the only objects are our perceptions. This is we put forth by like Descartes and Locke. What we experience in our mind is our perceptions. It's representational realism. We got the badly drawn. Here's the mind. And on representational realism, the theory is you got objects out there. You see them, and then you get an idea in the mind. And this is supposed to be of that. And of course, as Hume, the skeptics pointed out, that we think that the perceptions we have, they resemble each other. If you're looking at, we use the water bottle. Look at the water bottle, look at it, look away, look at it again, look away, look at it again. We think that the resembling perceptions are the same. I think I'm looking at the same water bottle. No matter what times I look away. But of course, as Hume notes, that their interruption, like when I look away, is contrary to their identity. Namely, I'm looking at it, looking at it, I look away, look back, and that gap is contrary to being the same thing, because there's a gap there. To use a practical thing, if I look away, think of like the magic trick. Someone could have swapped out the water bottle. If I'm not looking at it, someone could have replaced it. So it could be a different water bottle. It could be just like a stage prop made of styrofoam, spray painted. Now, so what we tell ourselves is this. Okay, so the interruption, me looking away, is contrary to its identity. I think it's the same thing. So what I tell myself, delusionally, is that there is an object. There's a continued thing that exists continually and distinctly. So when I look away and look back, I tell myself I'm seeing the same thing. But if I think about it, I'm not. Why not? Well, because on representational realism, the view is going after, what I'm looking at is, I'm not looking at the bottle, I'm looking at my idea, my perception, which is supposed to be of the bottle. So I'm looking at this, not the actual bottle. Because according to representational realism, I never see the bottle, I just see my representation, which is supposedly caused by the interaction of my senses with the actual object. And so reason tells me that I'm just deluding myself, essentially. Now, Hume does note that while philosophers reject the independence and continued existence of perceptions, only skeptics reject their continued existence. And he claims that skeptics really don't believe their view, that people really do think the bottle is there. So what we get going on, according to him, is what he calls a psychology of double existence. Before we go into that, though, anything about the stuff so far? It needs more Hume stuff. Drink some perceptions. Actually, it's not very tasty. I was going to say delicious perceptions, and that would be a lie. Just plain fountain water. Now, so we end up in the situation where our reason tells us one thing, and our natural impulses kind of impulse us another way. Now, what he claims happens is this. Once we've been exposed to the philosophy or the science, we can, of course, while we're focusing on it, we can, say things like, okay, the color's in my mind, the bottle's up there, the flavor is not in the cereal, it's in my mind. But he claims that basically habit draws us back to the vulgar view, that the taste is in the cereal. Again, I go back to the example of the shirt. What color is your shirt when you're not looking at it? It's blue. We don't think that, by our natural impulse, we think the shirt is, we're not doing the sciencey stuff. We think that all the stuff is out there, which we see is, it's only when we stop and think it through that we think the philosophical view. So we end up with a psychology of double existence, namely this. If we accept that psychological, the philosophical, scientific hypothesis that we've got ideas in our mind about objects out there, the physical shape is out there, the shape is out there, the taste is in your mind. The physical composition, photons and stuff is out there, the colors in your mind. So to make ourselves, feel good, we come up with this double existence, perceptions and objects. So our imagination tells us that our resembling perceptions have a continued and uninterrupted existence. We think, we look away from the bottle, look back, we're perceiving the same bottle. Reason, of course, tells us that if we go with representational realism, that our perceptions are interrupted and the object is constant. So what Ben basically is doing is contrasting what we call naive or direct realism, what you see is what you get, from representational realism, that what you see is a representation in your mind of what hypothetically is supposed to be out there. But of course those two are not, not consistent. Because if we really thought about it, if we believed that perceptions are dependent, interrupted, and different, we wouldn't go with a double existence. And similarly, if we believed, perceptions are continued and identically independent, we would have the double existence either. So his view basically is, if we believe what we believe, we wouldn't believe the other thing we believe. So if we believe there are objects out there, if we believe, WYSIWYG, we wouldn't believe in the perceptions, reputations in our mind. And if we believe it's just all in our, just in our mind, we wouldn't, just like Berkeley argued, we wouldn't believe in the objects. So what Hume seems to be doing is basically saying, naive realism and direct realism are incompatible. But from the vulgar standpoint, we're naive realists. What we see is what we get, colors out there. But the scientific, philosophical view is the representational realism, ideas in the mind about objects out there. And we believe both. But of course, they can't both be right. So we end up with, as he sees it, this, unholy combination. Now, what he thinks this allows us to do is this. We are able to humor our reason, basically, kid ourselves, but then return to our natural impulses. And this is something Hume does quite often. He talks about how philosophers think when they're in their philosophical closet, just, thinking about stuff. And then what happens when they go out in the world and just act like everyone else. And, in some regards, Hume seems to write about this because, like I said, when we sit down, learn the science and philosophy, we say things like, the shirt has no colors, the colors in our mind. But then when we're operating in normal everyday life, we think that the shirt is blue, even when we're not looking at it. So our common sense view, when we're just operating normally, not thinking, is naive realism, and once we get corrupted by philosophy and science, direct realism. But obviously they both can't be right. Either what you see is what you get, or you have perceptions in your mind that resemble objects out there, or perhaps they're both wrong. So, before going to the end of this particular skepticism, anything on the stuff so far that needs more human stuff? Okay, so into the home stretch. Now, the first particular he presents is this. We suppose that there are external objects, there's stuff out there, and we suppose that they resemble what's going on in our minds. Basically, again, the idea of, direct realism perhaps, or representational realism, depending how you're looking at it. Now, as he argued before, and again, he's just rehashing sort of an old argument, the cause and effect thing can't allow us to say, object, idea. Because again, we can never get out of our own mind, we never can see the object followed by our idea. We just have our idea. So, we have no reason to infer that the objects we suppose are out there resemble what's going on in our mind. How do we do it? Well, imagination. Basically what we do is, according to him, I have a perception, look away, look back, and then I imagine that it somehow continued. Roughly speaking, making stuff up. The second particular is this. We assume an object resembles the perception it caused. So we would say I've got an idea of the bottle, and my idea is like the bottle. But what we end up doing is this. We imagine, well, actually we do have a cause and effect connection. I have perception 1, look at the bottle, look away, look back. Perception 2. So perception 1 does follow perception 2 follows perception 1. And so what Hume claims is that in my imagination, I imagine my first perception caused my second one. And I throw in resemblance, first one like the second one, and to complete the union. And so basically what I do is, again, my imagination causes me to say, hey, the bottle's there, same bottle. Now, do we have any justification for that? Well, Hume says he started off assuming we ought to have implicit faith in our senses, which is not surprising. He's an empiricist. And he thought this would be supported by reason. But he ends up in skepticism. He says we should put no faith in our senses or imagination. Why? Well, what he claims is, and again, his ultimate goal was very much like Descartes. He wants to, the whole system of knowledge and philosophy is a big mess. He wants to straighten things out. And his hope was if he go and figure out how, why we believe in cause and effect, why we believe there's objects out, or why we believe in continued and distinct existence, then he could, solve all these problems. And he ends up in sad disappointment. He says, given his process of, going through this, we should have no faith in the senses. So if we try to say, I know there's continued and distinct existence because of my senses, no, we saw right at the start, can't do that. What about in the case of reason? Well, reason doesn't help us either. So what happens? Well, basically, we end up sort of trapped in an illusion, which is we suppose the resembling perceptions are the same. Put it a little clearer, a little formally. Look at the bottle, look away, look back, and I suppose that I'm perceiving, my perceptions are the same. It's the same perception. But of course, we know better, because we know our perceptions are interrupted. It's not the same perception. Now, Hume doesn't make this case, but the example I gave earlier, we can imagine, you look away from the bottle, and it's replaced by like an exact duplicate. And there's as a comedian says, it's like, something goes something like this. He says, went out, I came back home, and everything in my apartment had been replaced with an exact duplicate. And the question is, well, how would you know? And so using that kind of illustration, we suppose the perceptions are the same, but they're not. We obviously could be fooled. Now, philosophers, of course, well, by philosophers it means people who accept the representation of realism, they deny that perceptions are identical and uninterrupted. They basically create a new set of claims of perceptions and give them this continuity. So essentially what he's doing is basically saying people who come to the representation of realism, they're just making stuff up. And this is groundless, unsupported. So where does he end up ultimately? Well, after all that, going through all that torturous stuff, here's where it ends up. He claims in his semi-famous quote that skeptical doubt is a malady, it's an illness, and can never be radically cured. And so, in a way, you can kind of think of being a skeptic as basically kind of a mental illness, as he sees it. skeptics are, they get a mental illness. But unfortunately, you can never cure it. Why? Well, here's why. Going back to Descartes' project, Hume was basically saying, you take that skeptical thing, you can never actually beat the skeptic, because you can't, using the senses, you obviously can't get the continued and distinct existence of perceptions. He thinks reason fails too, and so we end up, the more you think about it, the more skeptical doubt increases. I mean, in a way, Descartes ends up in the same kind of problem. Descartes tries, meditation 1, to lay out all the doubts he can. But his goal is, of course, to get to certainty. He thinks he can beat the skeptic. But in the end, as we saw, he just, in a way, kind of makes things worse. When he throws out, he says, hey, you can't trust your senses, dream problem, evil demon. You're kind of like, well, we're just, there's no way out of that. And so, as Hume says, when you try to beat the skeptic, you just actually make it worse. It's like the old Brer Rabbit story, fighting that guitar person. The more you punch it, the more stuck you get. And then someone sets it on fire, and it's really bad. So he ends up basically saying that the more we think about it, the more skeptical we get. So what is the solution? Well, the solution basically is this. He says reason can never help us. So the thing to do is basically go out, roughly put, go out and have a beer, and you won't care anymore. And then he thinks that the way he sort of explains it is we kind of think ourselves into skepticism, and we find there's no way through reason or the senses or imagination to beat skepticism. But he says what we do is once we start thinking about it, go about our natural, our everyday business, we cease being a skeptic. If Hume is in the tavern, you say, Hume, do you think beers exist? He'd say, yeah, I'll have another. You would have no skeptical doubt about the beer. So he ends up, after going through all that, why do we believe in continued and distinct existence? Because we're deluding ourselves, essentially. Do you have any proof? We do not. Solution, have more beer, roughly put. And so that's Hume talking about skepticism regarding the senses. The next time we'll turn to the classic problem of personal identity, which is essentially the problem of what is it to be a person and what is it to be the same person across time. And we'll see what Hume has to say about that. And one thing you probably notice about Hume is he starts off trying to solve the problem and ends up saying, hell, I don't know, type of deal. So that's good. So a good answer is always hell, I don't know. Okay, so next time, more